The encounter on the open road. The sun was just beginning to rise, its warm rays painting the horizon with streaks of amber and crimson. The highway stretched out before James Howard like a ribbon of endless opportunity, the quiet hum of his SUV's engine providing a soothing backdrop to his thoughts. At 52 years old, James, a retired U.S. Army general, found solace in the simplicity of long drives. He had seen and done enough in his lifetime to appreciate these moments of peace. In the back seat of his sturdy SUV rested a steel safe, securely strapped down with reinforced belts. The safe was more than just a container. It was a vault of memories and legacies. Inside were personal documents, military commendations, and family heirlooms passed down through generations. It wasn't just locked. It was fortified with a unique defense mechanism. If anyone tampered with it, a spray of indelible paint would erupt, marking the intruder in a vivid, unmistakable hue. For James, the safe represented everything he had fought for: his family's legacy, his life's work, and the memories of a career spent serving his country. But on this particular morning, James wasn't thinking about the safe. He was focused on the open road and the quiet rhythm of the drive. Then the peace shattered. A sudden flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror broke James's calm. The wail of a siren followed, piercing through the stillness of the morning. He glanced at the speedometer, well within the limit. His turn signals were functioning, and his seatbelt was securely fastened. There was no reason for him to be pulled over. Really, he muttered under his breath, a hint of irritation creeping into his voice. He had spent decades navigating high-stakes situations with precision and calm, but the prospect of dealing with a traffic stop felt unnecessarily frustrating. Reluctantly, he guided his SUV to the shoulder, the crunch of gravel beneath his tires signaling the beginning of an encounter he hadn't anticipated. James took a deep breath, his military training kicking in. Stay composed, assess the situation, and respond accordingly. Behind him, the patrol car came to a stop. The door opened, and out stepped a stocky figure with a swagger that radiated authority, or at least the need to assert it. Sergeant Carl Henderson was in his late 40s, his uniform crisp and his expression stern. His eyes immediately zeroed in on the steel safe in the back seat, lingering there as if it held secrets he was determined to uncover. Henderson approached the driver's side window, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Good morning, sir," he said, his tone clipped and professional. "Mind rolling down your window for me?" James complied, lowering the window just enough to converse. "Morning, officer. Is there a problem?" His voice was calm but firm, the tone of a man who had nothing to hide. Henderson's gaze flicked back to the safe, his interest piqued. "That's an interesting piece of cargo you've got there," he said, nodding toward the back seat. "Mind telling me what's inside?" James felt his patience waver slightly. He had encountered men like Henderson before, overzealous, suspicious, and unwilling to accept simple answers. "It's just personal items," James replied evenly. "Nothing illegal, I assure you." The sergeant's eyebrows rose, his skepticism evident. "Personal items. In a safe. On the back seat." His voice carried a note of incredulity. "That's a little unusual, don't you think?" James met his gaze steadily. "Unusual doesn't make it illegal," he said, his tone measured. Henderson's smirk faltered, replaced by a more determined expression. "How about you open it up for me? Just to make sure there's nothing dangerous inside." James's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry, officer, but I'm not opening anything. There's no probable cause for you to search my property." That was the moment the tension shifted. Henderson straightened, his demeanor growing more rigid. "Listen here," he began, his voice taking on an edge. "I've seen a lot of strange things out on this highway, but a safe riding shotgun, that's got suspicion written all over it." James inhaled deeply, summoning every ounce of his composure. "With all due respect, Sergeant, I'm not breaking any laws. If you have a legitimate reason to detain me, say so. Otherwise, I'd like to continue my drive." For a moment, Henderson didn't respond. His eyes narrowed as he stared at the safe, as though trying to peer through the steel exterior. James could practically hear the gears turning in the surgeon's mind, the internal debate over whether to let this go or push further. Henderson stepped back, his boots crunching against the gravel once more. "Stay here," he said curtly, heading toward his patrol car. James watched him go, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy like an impending storm. In the rearview mirror, he saw Henderson standing beside his vehicle, speaking into his radio. The surgeon's gaze remained fixed on James's SUV, his posture radiating determination. It was clear he wasn't ready to back down. James's mind raced, running through his options. He had nothing to hide, but he also wasn't about to let his rights be trampled. He had spent his life defending the Constitution, and he wasn't going to abandon it now. When Henderson returned, his expression was resolute. He walked around to the back passenger door, his eyes locked on the safe as if it held the answers to all his questions. "All right," Henderson said, reaching for the door handle. "Let's see what's so important you can't even let me take a peek." That was the final straw. James stepped out of the driver's seat, his calm demeanor giving way to the quiet authority that came naturally to him. He moved to stand between Henderson and the SUV, his stance firm and unyielding. "Sergeant," James said, his voice low but commanding, "I strongly suggest you reconsider your actions. You have no right to search my property without a warrant or probable cause. And I assure you, if you proceed, you won't like the outcome." Henderson hesitated, momentarily taken aback by the shift in James's tone. But the moment passed quickly, and the sergeant squared his shoulders, prepared to push forward. The situation had reached a boiling point, and neither man was willing to back down. The open road, once a symbol of freedom and peace, had become the stage for a confrontation that would soon spiral into the unexpected. What neither of them realized was that the safe's defense mechanism, designed to protect its contents at all costs, was ready to unleash its wrath, and the consequences would be unforgettable. The paint trap springs. The morning sun climbed higher, its warm rays now casting sharp shadows across the roadside scene. James Howard stood his ground, his towering frame and calm yet firm demeanor presenting an unyielding challenge to Sergeant Henderson. Despite James's composed warning, Henderson's curiosity, and his overinflated sense of authority, pushed him forward. "You know," Henderson began, his smirk returning as he took a step closer, "if you don't have anything to hide, opening the safe shouldn't be a problem. Cooperation goes a long way, Mr. General Howard," James corrected sharply. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried the weight of decades spent commanding soldiers in high-pressure situations. "And I believe I've made myself clear. I won't be opening that safe without proper cause or a warrant." Henderson's eyebrows shot up, clearly surprised by the title, but the revelation only seemed to fuel his determination. "General, huh? Well, General, this is my highway, and I call the shots here." His hand moved to the SUV's back door handle. James took a step closer, positioning himself squarely in front of the door. "Sergeant, I'm warning you. Touch that safe, and you'll regret it." "That's not a threat. It's a fact." The intensity in James's voice gave Henderson pause, but only for a moment. He wasn't about to let this retiree, general or not, dictate his actions. "Step aside, General," Henderson barked, his hand now firmly gripping the door handle. James's silence spoke volumes. He didn't move, but his eyes locked onto Henderson's with a piercing intensity that could have cut through steel. Yet Henderson was too far gone in his mission to establish control. In one swift motion, Henderson yanked open the door and leaned into the vehicle, his eyes zeroing in on the safe. The metallic surface gleamed in the sunlight, a symbol of mystery and challenge. "Let's see what's inside this little fortress," Henderson muttered, gripping the safe's lock. His fingers brushed against the surface, and the moment they did, An almost imperceptible click sounded. James exhaled sharply, stepping back and muttering, "You've done it now." Before Henderson could process what was happening, a sharp hiss erupted from the safe. His eyes widened in confusion, and then came the explosion. A burst of bright green paint shot out with astonishing force, spraying directly into Henderson's face, chest, and arms. The sergeant stumbled back, coughing and spluttering, his uniform and exposed skin now coated in the vivid, unmissable hue. The paint clung to him like a second skin, dripping down in thick streaks. The scene froze for a moment, Henderson standing there like a startled deer, blinking rapidly as the realization of what had just happened set in. His patrol car's radio crackled faintly in the background, the only sound breaking the stunned silence. James couldn't help it. His lips twitched, and then a low chuckle escaped him. It wasn't a mocking laugh, but the kind of exasperated amusement that came from witnessing someone face the exact consequences they had been warned about. What the hell is this?" Henderson roared, his voice muffled by the sticky paint coating his face. He wiped at his eyes furiously, only to spread the mess further. "That," James said calmly, crossing his arms, "is the security system I mentioned. You ignored my warning, Sergeant. Now you're marked, for quite a while, I might add." You set me up," Henderson sputtered, pointing a trembling, paint-covered finger at James. "Set you up?" James's voice sharpened. "No, Sergeant. I warned you. You made a choice, and you're facing the consequences. That safe is designed to protect its contents. If you'd listened, this wouldn't have happened." By now, a few passing cars had slowed down, drivers and passengers craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the bizarre spectacle. The sight of a highway patrol officer dripping in neon green paint was too strange to ignore. A minivan pulled to the shoulder, and the driver, a middle-aged man with a camera phone, stepped out. "Whoa, what's going on here?" he called, already recording. Henderson turned toward the man, his face a mask of humiliation and fury. "Get back in your car," he barked, but the sight of a paint-drenched officer only made the man laugh. "Did you get sprayed by a skunk or something?" the man joked, holding up his phone to capture the surgeon's vivid new look. Henderson's face turned an even deeper shade of red beneath the green paint. He whipped around to glare at James. "This isn't over," he growled. "I'm sure it's not," James replied evenly. "But for now, I think you've got bigger problems." Another car slowed to a stop, and this time, a woman stepped out, her phone also in hand. "Oh my gosh, is that Officer Henderson?" she asked with a mixture of disbelief and delight. "What happened to him?" James didn't answer, but the look on his face spoke volumes. Henderson, now the center of unwanted attention, stalked back toward his patrol car, muttering curses under his breath. He grabbed a towel from the trunk and furiously tried to wipe off the paint, but the substance was designed to resist easy removal. The more he rubbed, the more it smeared, creating a grotesque blend of green and frustration. James leaned against his SUV, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. His initial frustration had given way to a sense of grim satisfaction. Henderson's arrogance had led him here, and James felt no sympathy for the surgeon's self-inflicted predicament. As the crowd grew, James knew this moment would become a story, perhaps even a viral sensation. But he wasn't concerned about the attention. What mattered was the principle, standing up for his rights and refusing to be intimidated by unnecessary displays of authority. "Sergeant," James called out, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the onlookers. "Next time, remember this moment before you decide to overstep your boundaries." Henderson didn't reply. He slammed his trunk shut and stormed into his patrol car, slamming the door behind him. The engine roared to life, and he sped off, leaving a cloud of dust and his dignity behind. James exhaled, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. He climbed back into his SUV, checked his mirrors, and eased back onto the highway. The road stretched out before him once more, offering the promise of peace and freedom. As he drove, James couldn't help but think about what had just transpired. It wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a reminder of the importance of standing firm in the face of overreach. And though the encounter had been unexpected, it reaffirmed his belief in the values he had spent a lifetime defending. The paint-splattered surgeon might not forget this day anytime soon, but neither would James. For him, it was another chapter in a life defined by resilience, principle, and the quiet strength of standing one's ground. The general's legacy. The highway stretched ahead, but James Howard's mind lingered on the encounter that had just unfolded. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale, not out of anger, but from the controlled restraint he had maintained throughout the confrontation. It wasn't the first time he had faced unnecessary scrutiny, and he doubted it would be the last. For James, every challenge carried with it a deeper meaning. Life had taught him early on that fairness wasn't guaranteed, but integrity and resolve could help navigate even the murkiest waters. As the SUV hummed along, the sound of the tires on asphalt became a rhythmic backdrop to his thoughts. Back in his military days, James had been a beacon of discipline and honor. Rising to the rank of general wasn't merely a testament to his strategic mind or physical endurance. It was a reflection of his character. He had earned the respect of soldiers and officers alike through countless trials, often leading his men into situations where failure seemed certain. And yet, time and again, they had prevailed. James's leadership style wasn't about barking orders or dominating with rank. He believed in understanding the people under his command. Their fears, their dreams, their motivations. It was this empathetic approach that made him a trusted figure, someone his troops looked up to, not just because they were required to, but because they genuinely wanted to. One incident stood out vividly in James's mind as he drove. It had been in the arid deserts of the Middle East, during a high-stakes mission to extract a stranded reconnaissance team. Intelligence had suggested an enemy ambush, and the situation was deteriorating by the hour. James had volunteered to lead the rescue team personally. His superiors had hesitated, but James had been adamant. "If I won't step into the fire for my men," he had said, "then I don't deserve this rank." The mission had been grueling, the heat unbearable, and the terrain unforgiving. But James' determination had been unshakable. Under his leadership, the team had successfully retrieved the stranded soldiers, returning them to safety with no casualties. That operation had earned him not only commendations, but the unwavering loyalty of those who served under him. It also cemented his belief in the power of preparation and foresight, qualities that had shaped his approach to life ever since. The safe in the backseat was a symbol of that foresight. It wasn't just a container for important documents and heirlooms. It was a safeguard for everything James held dear. Inside were medals, certificates, and keepsakes from his late wife, a woman whose memory was as vibrant and irreplaceable as the day they'd met. Sarah Howard had been the heart of James's life, a fierce advocate for justice and equality. She had been his anchor during the stormiest years of his military career. Together, they had raised 2 children, instilling in them the same values that had defined their partnership: courage, kindness, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Sarah had passed away 5 years earlier, leaving a void in James's life that no battlefield, no medal, and no achievement could fill. Yet, her influence endured. The safe carried not only her letters and photographs, but also her spirit, a constant reminder of the life they had built together and the ideals they had shared. James's reflections were interrupted by the sudden vibration of his phone. Glancing at the screen, he saw a familiar name: Captain Sarah Jacobs, his former protégé, and now a rising star in the Army herself. "Captain Jacobs," James answered, his tone warm but formal. "General Howard." Sarah's voice crackled over the line. "I saw the news. Is it true? Did some officer really try to mess with your safe?" James chuckled softly. "Word travels fast, doesn't it? Let's just say he learned a colorful lesson in respecting boundaries." Sarah laughed, the sound filled with admiration. "I hope someone caught it on video. I'd pay to see that." "I'm sure the internet will take care of that for free," James replied. "But what's on your mind, Captain?" "I wanted to check in and see if you're okay," she said, her tone shifting to one of genuine concern. "And if I'm being honest, I wanted to thank you. Everything I've achieved. It's because you believed in me when no one else did." James's grip on the steering wheel loosened, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Sarah, you've earned everything you've achieved. I may have opened a door or two, but you're the one who walked through them." "Well, I owe you regardless," she said firmly. "If you need anything, anything at all, you call me." "Noted, Captain. And thank you." As the call ended, James couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. Mentoring young officers like Sarah had been one of the most rewarding aspects of his career. Even in retirement, their successes felt like his own. The SUV rolled into a quiet rest area, where James decided to take a break. He parked under the shade of a sprawling oak tree, the sound of birds chirping providing a welcome contrast to the earlier chaos. Stepping out, James stretched his legs and leaned against the vehicle, taking in the peaceful surroundings. His gaze drifted to the safe in the backseat. To an outsider, it might seem like an odd possession to carry on a road trip, but for James, it was a lifeline, a repository of memories, achievements, and legacies that told the story of who he was. As he stood there, a thought struck him. The sergeant who had confronted him wasn't just a symbol of misplaced authority. He was a reminder of the prejudices and assumptions that still plagued society. James had spent his life fighting for fairness and justice, both on and off the battlefield. And while he no longer wore the uniform, his mission was far from over. He decided then and there that the incident wouldn't just be a funny anecdote or a viral video. It would be a teaching moment, a story he could share to inspire others to stand their ground, demand respect, and navigate life with dignity. Re-entering his vehicle, James started the engine and merged back onto the highway. The road ahead was long, but James Howard was no stranger to long journeys. Every mile he traveled, every obstacle he overcame, was another step toward honoring the principles that had guided him for so many years. And as the horizon stretched before him, James knew one thing for certain. This chapter of his life was only just beginning. The encounter that changed everything. The engine hummed steadily beneath James Howard's hands as he cruised through the serene landscape. The gentle hum of the tires on the open road was like a soft rhythm, almost meditative. James's mind had settled into a more peaceful state since the encounter with Sergeant Henderson. The stress of the previous exchange seemed to slip away with every mile that passed. He couldn't help but think about how absurd the whole situation had been, how one officer's suspicions had led to a ridiculous scene. Yet it was also a stark reminder that, in the world James now lived in, assumptions were made far too quickly, and people were judged by the smallest details. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message from his son, David. The message read, "Dad, how are you holding up after today? The whole thing is on the news. Let me know if you need anything." A soft smile tugged at the corner of James's mouth. David had always been the more analytical of his children, calculating and insightful. He had inherited his mother's pragmatic approach to life, but James had always known that David also had a deep well of empathy and a strong sense of justice, much like him. It was why James felt proud watching him carve out his own place in the world, much like he had. James took a moment to type a quick response. "I'm fine. No need to worry, son. Just another lesson in how to navigate life with dignity." He hit send and returned his focus to the road. The landscape had begun to shift now. What had been rolling hills and green fields had given way to a more rugged terrain, a reminder that he was getting closer to his destination, a small town tucked away in the mountains where he had planned to spend the weekend reflecting on life. As he neared the exit for the town, he felt a sudden pang of nostalgia. He hadn't visited this place in over 10 years, not since his retirement from the military. Back then, he had come here with Sarah to enjoy the quiet, peaceful surroundings away from the pressures of their busy lives. It had been one of those rare escapes that he cherished deeply. But now, there was a sense of finality in the air. A part of him wondered if this weekend would be a chance for him to reconnect with his past, and more importantly, reflect on his future. He arrived at the small cabin just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the landscape. The town was quieter than he remembered, but it still had that same comforting charm. There were no towering buildings, no bustling streets, just small houses with rustic charm and shops that looked like they had been standing for generations. The simplicity of it all was exactly what James needed. He pulled into the gravel driveway and turned off the engine. The cabin, nestled on the edge of a small clearing, seemed like it had been waiting for him all this time. Its weathered wood and stone foundation had stood strong against the elements, just like the life James had built. After unloading his bags and settling into the familiar, cozy surroundings, James made his way to the back porch, where he sat in a rocking chair. The evening air was cool but pleasant, and the sound of rustling leaves filled the space around him. For the first time in a long while, James felt a sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't just the stillness of the mountain town. It was a deeper peace, the kind that came from knowing that his life, despite the chaos he had sometimes faced, had been full of purpose. As the night drew in, James decided to take a walk. The town was small enough that he could wander without much concern. It was an opportunity to clear his head further, perhaps even find some answers to questions he had been contemplating. He passed by the local diner, where a few townspeople were gathered inside, enjoying a meal and chatting. Some of them waved at him as he walked by, and he waved back with a nod. He had always been a familiar face in places like this, someone who had built a reputation not only for his achievements, but for his integrity. Further down the road, James came to the old town square. There was a small park at the center, with a statue of a local hero from the town's past. The figure was weathered, like the rest of the town, but its presence still commanded respect. James stood before it for a moment, contemplating the significance of such tributes. In a way, they were a reminder of the importance of legacy, something that had been a constant thread throughout his life. And that's when he saw it, an unexpected sight. A figure sitting alone on a bench nearby, his back to James. The man was dressed in an unassuming jacket and jeans, but there was something about his posture that caught James's attention. He couldn't explain it, but something in the way the man sat, seemingly lost in thought, made him pause. James instinctively approached, his military background alerting him to the fact that there was something familiar about this figure. The man had an air of command, like someone who had seen things others couldn't even fathom. He walked a little closer and, as if sensing someone was nearby, the figure turned. The man's face was older, with graying hair and a strong jawline. His eyes, however, were sharp, familiar in their intensity. "James Howard," the man said, standing to shake his hand. "I thought I recognized you. Retired general. You haven't changed much." James felt his pulse quicken for a moment. This wasn't just a casual encounter. This man knew him. "And you are?" James asked, trying to place the face. "I'm General Michael Turner," the man replied, offering his hand. "We crossed paths once or twice during some operations. I'd say it's good to see you again, but this isn't the setting I would have imagined for a reunion." James shook Turner's hand, his mind racing. Turner was a legend in his own right, known for his leadership and quick thinking during critical military operations. Their careers had only briefly overlapped, but the respect between them was mutual. "I was just passing through," Turner continued, settling back down on the bench. "Funny how small the world feels sometimes. Here I am in a little town trying to enjoy some peace and quiet, and here you are, doing the same. It's as if the universe is telling us something." James nodded, his curiosity piqued. He took a seat beside Turner, the weight of their shared history filling the space between them. "Maybe it's telling us to slow down," James said thoughtfully. "For so many years, It was all about the mission, the duty. Now we're left with the consequences, the lessons learned, the friendships forged, and the ones we lost along the way. Turner's eyes softened, and he gave a slight chuckle. It's a tough thing, isn't it? Balancing everything we've given to our country with the personal sacrifices we've made. But in the end, it's about finding peace with it all. Some of us find that peace on the battlefield, and some of us find it in places like this. James looked at the town around them, the same quiet town where he had spent so many reflective moments over the years. Perhaps Turner was right. There was peace to be found, even after all they had been through. The question now was how to embrace it, how to move forward with the knowledge that, despite the battles fought, there was still so much of life left to experience. And as the stars began to twinkle overhead, James knew that this moment, this conversation, was the beginning of something new. The road ahead was still long, but it was no longer a road full of unasked questions. It was a road of understanding, of making peace with the past, and finding the courage to embrace the future, facing the unexpected. The morning that followed was like any other crisp, early autumn morning in the small town where James had come to find solace. A thin layer of fog clung to the tops of the mountains in the distance, and the cool breeze carried the scent of pine through the air. James had awoken early, as was his habit, and stood at the edge of the porch, contemplating the path that had brought him here. The small cabin he had rented for the weekend, nestled between towering trees, felt like a world away from the high-stakes environment he had once inhabited. James had spent the better part of the morning pacing the perimeter of his cabin, reflecting on his life, his choices, and his legacy. He had been a soldier for most of his life, rising through the ranks with a determination that left little room for personal reflection. The military had been his world, a place where decisions were made with a sense of urgency and finality. He had been taught to lead without hesitation, to prioritize the mission above all else, to suppress the questions and doubts that naturally arise in the minds of those who have seen the worst of humanity. But now, as he stood in the quiet solitude of this mountain retreat, those questions seemed to be resurfacing, demanding answers. The night before, his chance encounter with General Michael Turner had left a lasting impression on him. Turner, who had seen the same kinds of horrors in battle as James, had been his colleague and, in some ways, his counterpart. But it was more than their shared experiences that had brought them together on that bench in the town square. It was the undeniable pull of time, the realization that the world they had both fought for had changed, and that the struggle for meaning and peace did not end with retirement. James had learned over the years that not all battles are fought with weapons. Some of the hardest battles are the ones waged within, where the enemy is not another country, but time itself. And no matter how many missions were completed or medals earned, time remained undefeated. But it was that same enemy that brought him here, to this place of reflection. The truth was, James had reached a point where he had begun to question the cost of everything he had sacrificed. He had fought to protect his country, but now he was fighting to protect his own peace of mind. The weight of his service hung heavy, but it was also a catalyst for change. Change he was ready to face. Just as James was beginning to lose himself in these contemplations, his phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his reverie. The familiar notification sound made him hesitate for a moment. He didn't recognize the number, but something inside him urged him to answer. "James Howard," he answered, his voice steady. There was a brief pause on the other end before a voice spoke up. "General Howard, this is Lieutenant Amanda Harris from the Army's Special Operations Division. I know you may not remember me, but we worked together during Operation Shadow Strike. I hope you're well." James's pulse quickened. The name rang a bell, but it took a moment to place her. Amanda Harris had been a rising star in the ranks, someone who had impressed everyone with her leadership and tactical brilliance. James had worked with her in a high-pressure mission, but it had been years since their paths had crossed. "I remember you, Lieutenant," James said, his tone even. "What's this about?" "I'm afraid we've encountered an issue," Amanda continued. Something serious has come up, and we need your expertise. It involves a matter that's more personal than professional." James felt a surge of uncertainty. It wasn't often that something personal and his military service intersected, and the timing of this call was far from convenient. "What is it, Lieutenant?" he asked, his curiosity now piqued. "There's been a situation involving your military records. Some discrepancies have come to light, and we're not sure if it's an isolated issue or something bigger. We need you to come in, just for a meeting, so we can clear it up." James's heart rate quickened, his sense of calm shattered in an instant. The last thing he needed was to be pulled back into the world he had fought so hard to leave behind. But there was something in Amanda's voice that made him listen. "Discrepancies," he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "What kind of discrepancies?" "I can't go into detail over the phone, sir, but I assure you, it's urgent. Please, for your own sake, come in." The weight of the request hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. It wasn't just about the discrepancies themselves. The bigger issue was the implications of those discrepancies. Something was amiss, and it seemed to be tied directly to James's own records. Something from his past, something buried deep, was now being dragged to the surface. James knew that he couldn't ignore the call. His sense of duty, ingrained over decades of service, was too strong. He might be retired, but the principles that had guided his actions in the field were still very much alive within him. Whether he wanted to face it or not, this was his battle to fight. He glanced at his watch, the hands marking the hour with an impersonal tick. It was still early, but the day had already begun to take an unexpected turn. With a sigh, he packed up his things and made his way to the car, the familiar weight of the responsibility once again settling on his shoulders. The quiet retreat of the mountain cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary. It had become the calm before a storm that was rapidly approaching. As James made the drive to the nearby town where Amanda had asked to meet, his mind raced. What could these discrepancies be? Had something from his past come back to haunt him? He had always been meticulous about his work, always following the rules, always maintaining his integrity. But the call had been clear. This wasn't about a simple administrative error. This was something deeper, something that threatened to shatter the peace he had so carefully built. He found himself on the same stretch of road where he had encountered Sergeant Henderson the day before. The landscape seemed unchanged, yet James could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him. The same way the road ahead was clear but uncertain, so too did the path before him feel both familiar and unknown. When he arrived at the meeting location, a small, unassuming building on the outskirts of the town, Amanda was waiting for him. Her stern face softened just slightly when she saw him, but there was an edge to her presence, something that told James this wasn't just a routine matter. "General, thanks for coming," she greeted him. "Let's go inside. I'll explain everything." As they entered the building, the tension in the air was palpable. There was no going back now. Whatever it was that had triggered this meeting, James was about to confront it head-on. Inside, Amanda led James to a small conference room where a series of files lay spread across the table. She didn't waste any time, opening one of the folders and pulling out a sheet of paper. "This is the discrepancy we found, sir," Amanda said, her voice tight with urgency. "It seems that certain records from your service have been altered. But it's not just any records. It's the ones pertaining to a sensitive mission you were involved in during your early years." James studied the papers in front of him. His mind raced as he processed the information. The mission she was referring to was one he had almost forgotten about, an operation so secretive, so covered, that only a few trusted individuals had known about it. And now, decades later, it was being questioned. "Who's questioning it?" James asked, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. "That's the part we don't know," Amanda replied. "But it's clear that someone has access to highly classified information, and they're using it against you. We need to find out who." James sat back in his chair, the full weight of the situation crashing down on him. This wasn't just about discrepancies. This was about betrayal, about trust being violated, and it threatened everything he had ever worked for. The peace he had sought in his retirement had been shattered, and now, more than ever, he needed to uncover the truth. The truth revealed. The air in the room felt dense, thick with the weight of the moment. James stared at the documents before him, his mind racing, but his outward demeanor remained calm. He had faced battles that could break men, decisions that could haunt a lifetime. But this was different. This wasn't about physical warfare or strategic maneuvering. This was about something far more insidious: betrayal, trust, and the unraveling of a life's work. As Amanda continued to sift through the paperwork, pulling out various records and communications, James could feel the gravity of the situation pushing him to the edge. The realization began to settle in, a bitter taste that lingered in the back of his throat. Someone had gone to great lengths to manipulate the truth, to rewrite history in a way that would put him at the center of a scandal. But why? How deep does this go? James asked, his voice low, the resolve that had carried him through countless missions now laced with a quiet fury. Amanda paused, her fingers hovering over a particularly yellow document. That's what we need to find out. We've tracked a pattern of tampering with military records, and it's not just isolated to you. Other high-ranking officers from your era are also involved, but the fact that you're a retired general makes you a prime target. Whoever's behind this has access to classified files and is using them to target individuals who were involved in covert operations. James's breath caught. He knew what that meant. Covert operations were the darkest part of any military service. Missions with no official record, no oversight, and no public acknowledgement. The kind of missions that left no trace, only results, and often only shadows in the mind of those who had participated. If someone had gone to such lengths to alter records from these operations, it meant they were trying to expose something that had been buried long ago. So who's behind it? Who would want to destroy us like this? James pressed, his voice thick with disbelief and anger. We're working on that, Amanda replied, her eyes meeting his. But it's clear that someone with access to high-level security information is behind this. And they're not just after you. They're after the entire operation you were part of. James leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation sinking in. He had always known that some battles were fought in the shadows, that some things were better left forgotten. But this felt like something bigger than himself, something that reached far beyond the confines of his own career and personal experiences. Amanda closed the file and stood up, moving over to the window as if trying to gather her thoughts. The dim light from outside cast long shadows across the room, mirroring the uncertainty that hung between them. James could see that she was troubled, not just by the situation, but by the toll it had taken on her. He had seen that look before in soldiers who had seen too much, fought too hard, and been betrayed by the very system they had sworn to protect. It was a look that spoke of a broken trust, of a realization that not all battles are won with honor. You know, Amanda said, her voice softer now, there's something else. The tampering, it's connected to a bigger issue. Someone wants to expose everything. The operation, the people involved, the decisions we made in those days. They want to tear it all down. They think if they can discredit the mission, they can discredit everyone who was involved. James clenched his jaw. He had never expected the ghosts of the past to come back like this. The mission Amanda spoke of had been one of his most secretive, a mission so off the books that even the people closest to him didn't know its full scope. The enemies they had faced were powerful, but the truth, well, the truth was something altogether different. If it was exposed, it would change everything. Why now? James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why is this happening now, so many years later? That's the question, Amanda replied, her expression unreadable. And it's the one that's keeping me up at night. Whoever is behind this knows something that they want the world to see. But we don't know what it is yet. For the next few hours, James and Amanda worked in silence, sorting through the files, and trying to make sense of the information before them. The more they uncovered, the more the puzzle pieces began to form a picture, one that was far more complex and far-reaching than either of them could have imagined. It wasn't just a case of tampered records or hacked files. This was a deliberate effort to undermine an entire chapter of military history. The operation James had been a part of, codenamed Operation Valiant Horizon, had been shrouded in secrecy from the start. The mission had been deemed too controversial to ever be made public, and it had left many questions unanswered. But now, someone wanted those answers, no matter the cost. Amanda finally sat back, rubbing her eyes in exhaustion. "I think we're close," she said, looking at James. "But we need to move fast. If we wait too long, they'll get ahead of us." James nodded. Time was running out, and the stakes had never been higher. The enemy wasn't just an external force anymore. It was a shadow, one that lurked inside their own ranks, one that had taken advantage of the very trust that had been built over the years. With no time to waste, James and Amanda decided to meet with a small group of trusted individuals from the military intelligence community. It was a dangerous move, but it was the only way they could get to the heart of the matter. They couldn't risk waiting any longer. The meeting was set for the following day in a secure location, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was the perfect place to discuss matters that required secrecy. James arrived early, his mind sharp and focused. He knew that once they entered that room, there would be no turning back. The small group gathered around a table, their faces obscured in shadow, their presence commanding. James and Amanda briefed them on what they had uncovered so far. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone absorbed the gravity of the situation. Each person had their own role to play, their own piece of the puzzle to fit into place. The minutes stretched into hours as they worked tirelessly to piece together the information, working quickly and efficiently. The more they uncovered, the more they realized just how deep the conspiracy went. This wasn't just about military records. It was about power, control, and the ability to rewrite history. And as the final pieces fell into place, James realized the truth. The person behind all of this wasn't some rogue agent or enemy combatant. No, the mastermind was someone much closer to home. It was someone who had been involved in the operation from the very beginning, someone he had trusted with his life. The revelation hit him like a blow to the chest. The truth wasn't just a matter of clearing his name. It was about facing the harsh reality that even the people closest to him could be enemies in disguise. The fight was far from over, but now, James knew what he had to do. The past could no longer be left in the shadows. The truth needed to be exposed, no matter the cost. As James stood up, ready to face the enemy who had betrayed him, he knew that this final battle would define everything. The fight for honor, for truth, and for justice was far from over. And this time,